on with it.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys, for joining today's webinar, How to Buy Property Inside Super. So we've got two presenters tonight. Really excited to have them presenting to you. We've got Abraham McGuillan, CEO and Financial Advisor of Affluence Wealth Management. Abe's come from actually big powerhouse institutions in the past, AMP, Colonial First State, CommInsure, Future Plus, and transitioned to our affluence team back in 2015. Abe's a senior financial advisor. He also is our CEO and has had over 20 years of experience in the financial industry, so very knowledgeable. We've also got Felix on board today. So Felix is our director of property. Similarly, Felix actually started off with a bit of a financial advisor background, transitioned into property. Felix is been with us when we sort of took over the company back in October of last year, but has been doing the buyer's agent side for the last 5 years. So there's a wealth of knowledge there. So we're very excited to have these guys speak to you about this particular topic. So I'll just start off with the general disclaimers. Sorry, Abe, before we start. So just a reminder, guys, that this webinar is general advice in nature, does not take into consideration your personal situation or your objectives. So we do recommend that you seek professional advice before making any final decisions in terms of any of the strategies or discussions had today. If you have any concerns, you can feel free to reach out to our team at Affluence Wealth Management. Abe, as I mentioned, is an advisor, so he's an accredited under our AFSL with Affinia, and he's an accredited authorised representative. So I'll hand over the slides to you, Abe.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Melissa. So tonight, for tonight's agenda, what we might do is just talk through why an SMSF, all about it, the mechanics, how it works, as well as how to buy property using a self-managed super fund. And I've also put together a little bit of a case study as well with the starting balance if you just had an ordinary, retail or industry fund. And then we have Felix talking through the importance of property selection, particularly when looking at purchasing through a self-managed super fund. So I guess if we start with why an SMSF, well, ultimately it gives us diversification, flexibility, and tax advantages. You also have the ability to consolidate several superannuation accounts and can have up to 6 members or 6 different individuals as part of one fund. Again, the significant benefit is it does give you control and flexibility. And in that sense, it's the investment choice, knowing and controlling exactly where you're invested. It does come with tax effectiveness as well, particularly at retirement. So when you buy property in your individual names, you could be up for quite significant capital gains tax over time as well. Whereas in a self-managed super fund, that could be potentially completely tax-free or taxed at a maximum rate of 10% as you hold that property. Another benefit it gives you is asset protection, and I'll talk through that in a little bit as we go through how to buy property using SMSFs. Now, how SMSFs work is essentially you have a trustee or a controller of the self-managed super fund, and typically that would require a company structure in place. The SMSF itself is actually a trust deed. Okay, so it's a legal document that outlines all of the rules of how a self-managed super fund operates. You then need to put together an investment strategy and ensure that you've got assets selected as part of that investment strategy. And in today's context, obviously, property could be that core asset for your self-managed super fund. But we do want to note as well, an SMSF can invest in cash or bank accounts, term deposits, ASX-listed securities such as ETFs, shares, fixed income, managed funds, and even alternative assets like gold or artworks as well. Now, it's important to know that an SMSF does have ongoing obligations as well, particularly with the ATO. So every year, an SMSF has to have its own tax returns and financial statements generated. It also needs to be externally audited each year by an ATO-approved auditor. So part of running and operating a self-managed super fund does come with some obligations, but that's what we're here for, and we're here to help with managing all of your affairs. So the next slide goes through buying property using super. Overall, what this is called is a limited recourse borrowing arrangement. So if we look at your self-managed super fund, which is the piggy bank on the top right here, we've assumed that you've obviously consolidated all of your superannuation already, and you've placed it into a self-managed super fund. Like I mentioned, the SMSF typically would start off with its first asset being a bank account. Then we say the SMSF wants to buy a property. So we've got enough there for a deposit. Let's call it a 20% deposit and stamp duty to purchase a property. Now that property, if you're borrowing money from the bank, can't actually be owned directly by a super fund. And this is where we come back to that note that I said around asset protection. The reason why is the property asset needs to be held in what we call a bare trust entity. It's a separate trust that's held separately from the super fund. But what that does is it means the bank only has recourse to that asset. So if for whatever reason at all, the self-managed super fund or the members of the super fund can't default or can't pay the loan or interest on the loan, then the bank only has recourse to that property and not any of the other assets that the SMSF actually holds. On this slide, what I'm showing here is the income that's generated through the SMSF. That could be in the form of super contributions, whether that's employer contributions or self-employed contributions. There's also personal contributions that can go in that could be either be tax deductible or contributions made after tax. We've also assumed rental income, obviously from the property, goes into the SMSF. The SMSF then makes those loan repayments to the bank on a monthly basis, typically. And that's how we would look at structuring the purchase of property through a self-managed super fund. Now, one thing that's important, I guess, is we want to make sure that this is best for you. And so we've put together a bit of a case study and projections. So let's assume two different scenarios. One, having your retirement savings in an industry or a retail super fund versus using those same savings to purchase property using a self-managed super fund. Some of the assumptions that we've used in this projection is a client's age 43. He's earning an income of about 150,000 per annum. So if we look at that, he's earning about 11% of super contributions, and he's maximizing his concessional contributions cap each year, which means he's putting in an extra contribution on top of his employer contributions and also claiming that as a tax deduction every year. The starting balance is 300,000. And in the first scenario with an industry fund, we've just used the average rates of return for a growth risk profile or a growth index fund as well. With the self-managed super fund, we've looked at utilizing the $300,000 as a deposit and stamp duty to purchase a property valued at $700,000 with a loan to the bank of $400K. Now, what we've done is we've used a higher interest rate than usual of 9.1%. Obviously, we all know interest rates have been increasing over the last year or so. So we want to make sure that we cater or include a little bit of a buffer for that in case interest rates do continue to rise. And we've looked at a 25-year loan term. And in some of the other projections, we've used Sydney's property growth rates at 7.9% and a modest rental yield of 2% net. We've also looked at SMSF operating costs of about $3,300 per annum. Over the next 10 years, you can see here from that starting balance with an SMSF, you're starting with a net asset position of $300K, and the same with the industry fund. Now, fast forward 10 years from now, you'll have an industry fund with a balance of about $761,000 compared to a net asset value in the SMSF of $1.131,000. So again, a significant difference there. And as you can see, the loan is slowly being paid off as well each year. Now, that's all good, but I wanted to fast forward now, over the 25-year term And where we end up at age 65, which is when you can access your superannuation, there's a significant difference at that point in time. So the SMSF using today's dollars, so what I mean by that is we've discounted this for a CPI or inflation. The SMSF would be sitting at a net asset position of just over 2.5 mil, whereas an industry fund at 1.2. Okay. What that means, I guess, is the amount of income you can draw from the two different scenarios is quite important. So with an industry fund, you're looking at drawing at 5% of the balance at that time of about 104,000 compared to 160,000 using a self-managed super fund. In both scenarios, as long as we're drawing down a balance of 5%, we should be able to retirement savings should last beyond life expectancy of age 83, although we know people are living a lot longer these days as well. But we want to make sure that you've got enough assets there to support your income needs at retirement. And so that's pretty much it from me on my side on how super funds work. I think it's important now to look at the right selection for property and how we do that. And I'll hand over to Felix Tang.
Thanks, Abraham. Appreciate that. Yeah, so tonight I really wanted to kind of dive in and really share with everyone a bit more context with regards to what to really consider when looking to purchase property through your self-managed super fund. So just some general housekeeping rules, as Mel mentioned as well. Everything is general in nature. The content of this publication is more for reference purposes, and it does not constitute any financial or legal advice. So the topic and areas that I really wanted to touch on was the advantages of actually purchasing a property through your self-managed super fund, what to consider when you're looking at purchasing property through this vehicle, and then just to really highlight a number of case studies so you can really distinguish the type of properties that you should be looking to source and purchase when considering this option. So as Abe's obviously mentioned the key advantages with regard to setting up a self-managed super fund. The areas that I wanted to kind of really touch a bit more on is that when I do sit down with clients who are looking to build a portfolio of investment properties, I guess this super probably isn't an asset class that they kind of consider as a potential vehicle to add towards that that goal in terms of building that portfolio. And there could be a various number of reasons. It could be that their super fund at the present could be a small balance and may not contribute towards enough to actually purchasing a property. I guess the benefit here with a self-managed super fund, as Abe mentioned, is that you can actually pull funds together with up to 6 members. As long as you have the same goal and objective, you can obviously come together and purchase and obviously consolidate your super together. And that's one of the key benefits that I really see when looking at purchasing property and utilizing this as a vehicle, is that you don't have to do it alone. There's obviously, various other ways of doing that. It's going to give you more flexibility as well as investment choice. It's a really good kind of scenario for people in the medical profession where they might be looking at purchasing a commercial asset for a number of medical practitioners, and if they come together and utilize those benefits together to then purchase that premises and then lease back that to their respective businesses. So when considering investing in property, I do say super isn't an area that we should kind of just rule out. I mean, obviously it's good to have a really strong diversification in terms of different asset classes, but if you're looking to purchase property, super is like a self-managed super fund is definitely a good asset or vehicle to consider. And I think that's really one of the key advantages, is that not just pulling funds, but you can obviously leverage off a limited recourse borrowing to then increase your borrowing capacity to purchase an asset within your self-managed super fund. Now, there are some key considerations when actually purchasing property through your super. It does relate a bit more towards the more residential type of properties, and I think the sole purpose test is really important. It's there for a reason. It's there to ensure that when you are purchasing a property, it is for the sole purpose of an investment. So it's not obviously something that's non-arm's length. It's there to derive an asset base for your retirement goals. So it's very clear that if you're purchasing a residential property, it can't be for the purpose of living in it, can't be rented out to a member or their relatives, and that way at least there is a clear distinctive goal with regards to the purchase to ensure that it is going to meet your retirement needs. Now, it is a bit different for commercial, as I mentioned. So you can purchase a commercial premises and lease it back to your own individual business. It needs to be at market rate. and there needs to be a commercial lease in place. That will then ensure that there is an arm's length transaction. So a few things to consider when you are looking to purchase property. The three asset classes that I would say to consider when you are setting up an SMFS and considering property in there, you've got your residential, which we've touched on, commercial, and then there's property trust. So property trust is when you kind of obviously purchase into property where you might, your superannuation fund might form part of a unit trust. So you might be a shareholder towards a bigger asset. So it could be like a commercial building where you own a percentage of that. So I think to keep it really simple tonight, I just wanted to really just touch on the residential space, and that way at least everyone can resonate through that. And obviously the examples will highlight that. Just makes it nice and simple. I mean, if there's demand or if there's interest in the commercial and property trust area, we can definitely do another session on that. But tonight, let's just keep it really simple. So when, I guess, investing in property, and this is probably investing in general, whether it's inside a super or outside super, the key areas obviously is capital growth and serviceability. I mean, we've seen rates increase at a rapid pace over the last 12 months, so servicing is a big thing. When we're looking to purchase property inside self-managed super fund, I think the clear distinction is if you're borrowing funds, obviously a limited recourse borrowing arrangement, there is some requirements where you can't obviously change the nature of the asset. So you can't, buy a place that's 2 bedrooms, and then you can't pour money into it and obviously renovate it and change it into like a 3 or 4 bedroom house. And because there's certain guidelines with that limited recourse. So it's important when you're purchasing through the SMFS that the property is obviously new in nature. Obviously, if you can get something brand new or a couple of years younger in age, which is low maintenance, that would definitely suit the vehicle more better. It's just the way they've obviously with the banks, they don't obviously want you to tamper too much because obviously there's a sense of liability to it. But if we're kind of really thinking about what we really need to hone in on, I think there was obviously, when people are considering property within a self-managed super fund, they're usually looking at the serviceability, and that's definitely important. You want to make sure the rental is covering the loan repayments. But as the projections Abe has shown, is that capital growth is your biggest distinguishing factor in terms of what it would look like after 25 years. So you really need to pick, properties that are actually strong in growth as well. I mean, obviously Sydney will know over the last 30, 40 years, the average growth rate's been 7.9. Some other states have been a bit lower. So, but there is that trade-off. And in the case studies, I'll clearly show you those different distinguishing kind of traits in terms of different asset classes as well. I guess when you're looking at location, when you're looking to purchase property through your self-managed super fund, where that's going to be very, very heavily kind of geared in terms of picking the right location is determining the level of supply. So you want to be buying in areas where supply is very limited. That's going to be one of the biggest distinguishing factors in terms of your level of growth, as well as population. So if there's strong population growth and limited supply, it's just general economics that there's definitely going to be a strong capital growth in that area. And then there's obviously different property types. So buying a house compared to buying an apartment or a townhouse and villa. Look, I don't have anything against any asset class, but what we have seen over the last 30 years is that anything associated with land typically grows more in value because it is more scarce to obviously find more land. But it's not to say that if you bought a 2-bedroom apartment in the Northern Beaches compared to buying, a house out in Southwest Sydney, that the growth wouldn't be the same, if not maybe more in the Northern Beaches. So it is going to be case by case, and that's the importance when you're doing your due diligence, is to really dive into those numbers to ensure you just haven't plucked something out of the air, but you've done your due diligence and looking at past growth, infrastructure, population growth, amenities. They're obviously key drivers that are going to allow an area to obviously outperform the neighbouring suburbs. So I'm just going to dive into a couple of case studies to really highlight what to really consider when looking for an asset within your self-managed super fund. And just I'm being really mindful in terms of the price points and trying to keep it below a 750 kind of acquisition price, because obviously with self-managed fund, the average probably asset in there that we're kind of looking at is having a capital of about 300,000 in there. So this property, this is something that you can buy today out towards the Hunter Valley, literally 45 minutes out from Newcastle, brand new house, over 500 square meters, rental yields close to 5%. The area itself is a newer estate. It's probably been only about 7 years old, but in the last 5 years, we saw about a 45% growth in that particular area. It's been driven very heavily by young families and professionals, given its location to Newcastle CBD itself. A lot of major builders like your McDonald Jones, Mojo, Eden Bray have all started building houses up there because they've seen the actual level of demand up in that particular precinct. Now, this is, you know, a really good kind of case study to really kind of consider, given the fact that it is a house. Obviously, land value and appreciation is there, but also it's got a really strong yield to it, because if you're bringing properties and looking at houses closer to Metro Sydney, you're probably looking at yields around 3%. So for SMFS, it's purely about investment, about the numbers, but it's also about the growth and obviously the lower maintenance. Something brand new, you've still got the 6 years warranty, you've got the luxury of the depreciation. So this is an example, is a really good kind of idea to kind of highlight that there are still opportunities in some really good key areas within New South Wales at this particular price point, because I know a lot of people may have a budget of $1 million and they're still struggling to find something within, you know, Sydney or New South Wales that still presents good value. So just to let you know, it's still out there. You just need to know where to look. The second example, in case I don't want to share with, is probably something that you may have seen a bit more within the Queensland type of market, your dual income type properties, where they've built it purely for the investors. So dual income just means that you can rent them out separately to 2 different tenants. A property like this obviously provides a high yield. You're probably looking around the 6% mark for that, but also the trade-off is the capital growth. So Queensland's never obviously had a stronger growth than New South Wales, and that's where you're going to find there's going to be that distinguishing factor in terms of your yield compared to capital. So I think it's important to really see that even though there is I guess an advantage of purchasing something like this, because you've got, you know, a high yield, it's what does it look like from a projected value in 30 years time in terms of growth. So not just looking at the short term, but also looking at the long-term value. And I think that's what's important when you're looking to purchase property, you know, not just in self-managed, but also outside, is to look at your various options and compare what's going to be suitable for your own needs, and not just kind of running it purely based on, you know, a yield perspective. So even though the yield is quite high, the purchase price for something like this is probably sitting more close to the mid-7s. So the difference between, I guess, repayments and rental, there is still a bit of a shortfall for it. So just taking that into consideration. Obviously, over time, you will notice that the principal repayments will reduce the actual loan value. So that will reduce and the rentals will increase. So you'll reach a point where there's a break even. But just in the immediate term, there is a bit of a difference. The next 2 examples I'm going to share are 2 apartments in Sydney. They're ones that we've recently purchased for some clients. Just to kind of really give you some context in terms of a lower price point and what is still quite achievable. This 650 market is a very, very competitive market at the moment, given the fact that you've got a number of participants and buyers. So you've got the first home buyers, you've got self-managed super fund buyers, and you've got early entry investors looking at this price point. So from what we're seeing, it is a very, very active market at the 650 mark, but it's not to say that you still can't find something. So something like this in Surry Hills, kind of touched up, low maintenance. The benefit of this one was that it was on a dual level living. So the bedrooms upstairs, it's got the living downstairs, but it had 2 bathrooms. So it's very rare in Sydney to find a 1-bedroom apartment with 2 bathrooms. You usually have 1, and that's usually linked to the bedroom. So when we're looking at property, especially apartments, we need to find a distinguishing factor that's going to provide more value for it. So something like this, from a valuation perspective, it's going to obviously grow more than your standard 1-bedrooms. Given the fact of where it's located, as we can see, the growth over the last 5 years has been about 15%. Now, I guess the benefit here is the rentals for 1-bedrooms are quite high. They're still sitting around the 5% mark in Sydney. So I find that's a really good balance. I mean, not everyone, you know, is into apartments, but I think if you're looking at it from a projected perspective and we're looking from an investment point of view, because we're never going to live in, and you can't live in it anyway because it's self-managed super fund, it could be a really good entry point given the fact that it's only around the 650 mark. There's still a lot of potential growth. what I'm seeing in particular with the 650 mark, given the recent changes to the stamp duty concessions, is that anything up to 800 for the full exemption, that price point, there's going to be a lot of quick movement because now a lot of first home buyers are going to have a lot more flexibility rather than tapping out at 650. So it is a market that is very, very active, especially from 1 July. So there's really some really good gains to be made there. The other one I wanted to share was a 2-bedroom apartment that we also purchased in Lane Cove. If you kind of jump on Lane Cove, you probably won't find any 2-bedroom apartments that are actually below 700,000. If they are, they're probably not as well maintained as this one. This one actually had a lock-up garage as well, and literally a 5-minute walk to the shop. Something like this would be rock solid. I mean, the rental itself, 650, if not more, would rent out within the first week, given its location and distance to the city. If you know Lane Cove, it's about a 15-minute bus ride directly straight into the city. So as we can see as well, the difference between the rental repayment, the rental payments, the loan repayments to the rental is quite small as well. But then you've got a really good growth factor to it. So, you know, these examples I really wanted to just share and really highlight, you know, there are properties out there with below the 750 mark, which can really cater and meet your needs with regards to your objectives and goals in terms of what you're looking to purchase through your self-managed super fund. If it's a residential property, what I think is important is understanding where to look, but also once you understand and found a specific suburb, it's what the type of properties you need to target to ensure that you're going to get the best value for money. I think the 2 questions that come to mind for me when kind of thinking about property within your self-managed super fund is your current self-managed super fund at present, or if you're super, is it actually performing to what your expectations are? Is it doing what you want it to do? You know, because I know some people set up self-managed super funds and they kind of sit there not knowing where to invest it. And so it might just sit dormant in your cash account. So, you know, it's really important to be active. But the second question is, you know, have you got a strategy and a plan in place in terms of achieving that goal for the future? And is that strategy going to meet what your retirement goals are when you do turn 65 and whatever your income needs are? So I think, you know, if there's some questions that you really want to kind of dive into and understand a bit more, here are some QR codes to Abraham and myself. More than happy for you guys to book in like a discovery session or meeting for us to kind of go through your needs in a bit more of a personal level and kind of map out a strategy for you. But I think, yeah, it's a really good kind of asset class to really consider. SMFS is a really great vehicle to house it. As Abe's mentioned, it's obviously from a taxing perspective as well. But yeah, look, I think if you guys have any questions, you know, we're going to open this session up to a Q&A. So feel free to jump in and, yeah, ask away.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Felix.
No worries.
No questions that I can see here, but I might have one actually. So with that recent purchase in, you know, Surry Hills, for example, I think that's a really interesting one. When you're going out to find these types of properties, what are you typically coming up against?
Yeah, like it's a lot. I mean, we're finding, like what I mentioned, first home buyers.
Yes.
There are actually some downsizes as well in that market space. But yeah, a lot of people are looking at that from a really good entry perspective, and purely because it provides a really good servicing level. It's not something where you're going to struggle from a week-to-week basis in terms of what your loan repayments are, but also the vacancy rates are very low. Like, given the location, you know, you're going to have an ample supply of, you know, really high quality tenants looking to lease in that space. Properties like that typically don't last too long. In this market, it is very competitive. You will see, you know, easily over 20 to 30 attendees at an inspection. So having your due diligence and your framework in place is really important. I think you mentioned obviously having the Baird Trust and all that in place. So obviously purchasing a property through SMFS is probably a bit more trickier than your standard outside, because you can just put a name to it. In this case, you don't obviously need to make sure that Baird Trust and everything is kind of ready to go, because once you sign a contract, it's very hard to change the name without, you know, incurring any penalties.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think that's quite important as well. It's just being prepared, having everything established, set up and ready to go. And probably the last quote from me is making sure you've got a plan in place. So what we do to add value is actually run those projections side by side with what you currently have today and where you could be. And again, it's important to identify those goals and objectives of yours, just to make sure this is the right thing for you and you know exactly what you're getting yourself into. But there's definitely considerable upside and value, I guess, to running through this strategy. So that's pretty much it from us. I think time's up. There's no other questions that I can see. So there is.
Paul's asked the question. Yeah.
Oh, there is. Cool. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, with apartments and strata consideration charges with the SMFS, so that's still obviously the SMFS, like the bed trust would own that property. So any charges and rates will get billed to the actual SMFS, as opposed to your personal name. So when you do purchase on title, that all needs to be clarified with the solicitors, so that all the rates and utilities are then forwarded to the appropriate, I guess, title holder. If you're having the SMFS managed by an institution, those invoices can be directly straight there, and then they'll make payment according to that.
Are those expenses generally like tax deductible for the SMSF? SMSF.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. So a lot of the same tax deduction rules that you would have if you owned a property in your name would also be tax deductible to a self-managed super fund. So it is a good way, like I said, in terms of tax effectiveness, minimizing tax as well along the way. It's a great vehicle, I guess, for you to own property. Another thing I forgot to mention as well is also just from a cash flow perspective, in your individual names, you're not necessarily having a significant outlay for holding these properties because it is being serviced as well, not just by the rental income, but your employer super contributions. So that's another factor to consider.
A lot of the scenarios that Felix had up there did show that there's that gap, I guess. So you've got your loan repayments based on the interest rates being at 9, which is obviously not current market, but stress tested. But how do you try to close that gap between the rental covering the debt repayments?
Yep, definitely. No, good question, Mel. I think, look, making additional super contributions as well not only gives you, additional tax deductions in your individual name if you've got the caps to do that. Having multiple members in the super fund. So if you've got, a couple, both employed, there's 2 sets of super contributions now coming in as well. You could look to pay down that loan a lot faster as well. So that will obviously, like Felix said, there is going to be that break-even point to when these properties become positively geared. And having it in super funds a great vehicle because you're not paying too much tax on that additional income that the property is generating.
And if I sell my property before retirement, is that taxed at the capital would be taxed, and what happens if I wait till retirement?
Yeah, great question. So if you were to basically sell the asset prior to turning age 60, then the capital gains tax within a super fund, as long as you've held the asset for more than 12 months, is capped at 10% effectively. If you hold it if you're over 60 and retired, now mind you, might be if you're 65 and still working, and then sell the property, that could potentially be completely tax-free, any capital gains in that. Again, there's certain rules, certain thresholds that we need to consider, and the overall circumstances, but definitely something that, we can help support and advise on.
Right. Thanks for that, guys.
Excellent. Well, thanks, everyone. We've had some great engagement and some good feedback. So if there's anything that you need, feel free to give us all, jump onto those QR codes, I'm sure, or send us an email, and we'd love to connect with each and every one of you. Thanks, everyone, and have a good night.
Thanks,
Awesome.
guys.
Thank you. Please.